Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see you here, either live or as a person watching our replay. But I wanted to welcome you to our Art of Advocacy live show we do each week on Facebook. And if you're looking for tips and strategies and new ideas about creating inclusive schooling in your district, then you're in the right place, because today we'll be talking with Dr. Julie Costin from Syracuse University. And I've been lucky enough to hear Julie speak at several different national conferences. I've taken some of her courses, read books of hers, and I just know that you guys are going to just really appreciate all the advice and information that Julie can share with us today about inclusion. I'll let Julie talk a little bit more about herself. One of the things that she might not mention is that she's also an artist. And I was lucky enough to have one of her paintings that she made. And I love the message in the painting is release. So today, I hope that you'll be able to release any fears you have about whether or not your child is ready to be included in general education classes, and that will be all open-minded to look at some new ways that we can make sure our kids have that sense of belonging. So I'd like to welcome Julie. And Julie, if you can maybe share a couple more things about yourself.
Thank you, Charmaine. It's so great to be here, and I'm excited about this opportunity. I had no idea that you were going to show my artwork, and I think you're the only person on earth that would label me as an artist, but I like the label. I'm going to keep it. So thank you for that. So as Charmaine said, I'm from Syracuse University, and the work that I do is all about preparing educators to work with and teach all kids with any disability label or students without any sort of labels, all in one place. And that's the concept of inclusion that we'll be talking about today. It's very important to me. I was a teacher, so I taught elementary, middle, and high school. So I'm really quite connected with all the different ages and stages in kids' lives and curriculum and things that are necessary in all those areas. I'm a parent of two children, Ella and Sam, and one's in high school and one's in middle school now. And my son also has a disability, so he's legally blind, and so I have a little bit of experience on both sides of the table, which I think has really brought me to this work with parents to realize just how much people have to know and understand and be able to do to advocate for their children. So that's part of the work that I do and think about. I should tell you that I do a lot of consulting work with districts. Probably the bulk of my work is going into school districts and helping them become more inclusive and really think about how to include all children. And then I do some expert witness work with families. So when families contact me and really are struggling to get their child included and they've exhausted every avenue, I do some of that work too. So that's pretty much who I am and what I do.
Well, thank you. And I just wanted to let you know that Micah's on live with us and says hi to you. So I'm glad Micah was able to join us today. And I'm sure we'll have other viewers jumping on as we go through. But I thought maybe to start, it would be a good kind of foundation for us to understand how you define inclusion, because if we read journal articles or anything, there's a variety of definitions. But so how do you define inclusion?
Such a great question. I'm glad we're starting there, because I think every person listening hears inclusion and has a different answer. What is inclusion? The other thing that happens to me a lot is I'll go into schools and they'll say something like, they'll usually whisper it, right? We've got an inclusion class down the hall, or these are the inclusion children, or things like this. And for me, if you have an inclusion class or inclusion children or inclusion teacher, it means you don't have inclusion. So I'm going to start with a really broad definition. When I think about inclusion, I think it's a human right. It's the human right we all have to be part of a community, to live, work, and play together. And that's the largest piece of it. And then it kind of, goes down to it's a best practice. So a lot of people do this work because what happens when we include all kids is their achievement levels rise, right? Now they can achieve greater things with higher expectations. It's also a philosophy. So another way of thinking about it is it's a belief system or a way of thinking in which you view all human beings from a lens of belonging. All of us can do our best work. I mean, any one of us listening can think about this. We do our best work when we feel like we're part of something, when we feel like part of a team, when we feel accepted, when we feel engaged, involved, challenged, right? And the opposite is also extremely true. When we feel segregated from or separated from, we're not able to do our best, give our best, be invested in the work. And so it's a philosophy that starts with belonging, meaning every person has the right to belong. I look a lot, Charmaine, to Norman Kuntz's definition. In fact, I almost always use Norman Kuntz's definition in anything I write because I've not found a better definition. But he basically really says, I have it in front of me, so I'll just kind of read it. It's the valuing of diversity within the human community. When inclusive education is fully embraced, we abandon the idea that children have to become normal in order to contribute to the world. So it's kind of letting go of this idea that there's an ideal normal and that we should strive for that, and that we need to remove or remediate people, human beings, so that they can be returned to some place. So it's abandoning those notions that schools are deeply entrenched in schools. So it's also a law. And so, this is a really controversial piece. Is it a law or isn't it? The word inclusion shows up nowhere in the law, but least restrictive environment and IDEA really have a preference for all students being together. And so I look to least restrictive environment a lot and what that means. And it's a practice. So it's all kinds of practices, from sometimes two teachers working in a room together, to differentiation, to a really rich curriculum and content. There are many pieces that have to be involved in inclusion. At the very least, it's all children together, and at the most, it's a pretty complex structural system where all kids are educated together.
Right. And I think as an advocate, what I see is parents wanting their kids to be included in general education classrooms, and I totally support that. However, just having, the percentage of time in general ed increased on the IEP without having those other, supports for staff, or sometimes training for staff, or, the whole idea of co-teaching, differentiated instruction, all of that, if those pieces aren't in there, just because the IEP says your child's going to be in general ed 80% of the time, probably isn't going to be a successful experience.
Right. I think you're right. It's more than percentage of time in general education. And so the weird thing is it's complex and it's not, right? And so it's complex in that definitely people need to know how to differentiate and meet students' needs. A lot of people use the complexity of inclusion to be a reason that they won't move forward. It's too difficult. We're not trained. We're not ready, right?
That's true.
The majority of the practices that I would call good inclusive practices are good teaching practices, right? And so we use this, we're not ready, we're not trained, the supports aren't in place, we can't do it for 2 years or 5 years, right? This is what I hear a lot in schools. And so I did just talk about how complex it is in some ways, but in other ways, it is really great educational practices like differentiation happening in the classroom. So very often I work with teachers who are wildly skilled at seeing individual learners in their classrooms. And when I have a teacher like that, inclusion isn't an issue. It's not a challenge. Right. I see every learner, I use their strengths, I create a warm community, and so off we go, right? It doesn't mean we don't have to problem solve, for sure. But it means the problem solving question isn't, does this student belong here? That's not the question. The question is, how do we make sure the student belongs, right? And it's just reframing the object of remediation. It used to be, how do we fix this kid so they can be here? And now it's, how do we fix the system environment classroom so all can be successful here? And I work with really talented teachers who can do that beautifully with little to no training, right?
Right.
I also work with teachers who have such a deep belief in segregate, separate, and remediate that there's a little bit of undoing that has to happen so that they can see that that isn't the best practice for human beings, right?
Right.
And so that's an attitudinal shift that takes a little bit of time. But once we get over that idea, and the whole concept is we're all together, we're here, now the strategies come pretty quickly to those teachers because they're usually quite skilled. And so, the question of where should kids be educated often becomes more important, than how.
Oh, exactly. So for parents, what would be some strategies that you could recommend, if they're just kind of starting this journey to advocate for their child to be, seen as an equal and learn side by side their peers in the general ed classrooms? What tips can you give parents?
Yeah, so I thought about this and I wrote down some ideas. So I'm just going to kind of go through these big ideas and I'll kind of bullet them for you. So if you're taking notes, you can grab each big idea. The first big idea that I have is know your role. And what I mean by that is know and understand that you're a co-equal member on that IEP team. And speaking as a parent in this case, I've been to many meetings where all the quote unquote experts sit around the table, with their medicalized knowledge of my child. And it's very difficult to find your voice. It's very difficult to say the things you want to say because there's a lot of feelings involved.
Right.
But knowing that you're a co-equal member and preparing for that IEP meeting as a co-equal member, those experts at the table have they've spent some time, they've prepared reports, they're ready to go for that meeting. And parents, if this is something that you are able or willing to do, sitting down and thinking, what do I want to make sure we do at this meeting? What do I want to make sure gets included in my child's IEP at this meeting? I'm a co-equal member, therefore I'm going to be ready and prepared, for one. And for two, I'm going to really voice my opinion in kind of the same way that anyone else does at the table. So that's my first thing. The second is articulate your vision. What that means is, prior to the meeting, stop and think about, what is your vision? What do we want for our student? And don't be afraid to write it down, pass it out, send it ahead of time, share it out loud. I mean, you'll read it and it'll make your voice shake or it'll make you cry, and that's okay, right? Because telling people your vision is the very first step. If you're meeting and we're discussing all the little nuances in the child's IEP, nobody ever stops to hear the big picture from you, family members, right? To say, this is what we want, this is what we dream about. I found, let me see if I can find it in here. I was going to read one for you so people could know what they look like. Maybe I didn't put it in here. So I've worked with many families who've done this. Sometimes people call it their manifesto or their family vision or whatever. But basically, this is who this child is to me, right? This is how they're strong, gifted, their strengths, their talents, their abilities. These are our challenges and our worries for our child. And then this is how these big ideas really interface here in this IEP. So what I mean by that is, let's say your dream is that your child has a lot of friends. Let's say that's a dream of yours. Well, okay, then we've got to think about percentage of time your child's in general education. How often are they surrounded by typical peers? What options for engagement are happening? And so you start to think about goals that make sense for your dream for your child, as opposed to, he's 2 standard deviations below the norm in this reading, test, right? And so keeping the meetings focused on your dreams and goals for your child can be really helpful. Not to say that reading is an important goal, it certainly is, but keeping that in mind, sometimes it gets lost. So I said, know your role is the first thing. Articulate your vision. So your family vision statement would be really important. The third is learn what's happening. So you mentioned it earlier, Charmaine. You said, it might say 80% time in the general ed classroom. Well, what does that look like, mean? When are they pulled? What is, and so I'm just going to tell you that I don't believe that often what's written on IEPs is exactly what's happening in the child's day.
Oh, come on, Julie. Come on.
I don't know I should have probably softened that, but it's pretty common that what's written on paper isn't based in what's happening in a child's day. So before we get really worked up about what's happening on paper, I think it's much more important to get worked up about what's happening for my child all day long. And if your child uses verbal speech, you can ask a lot of questions. If your child doesn't use verbal speech, there are lots of ways to learn things about things. Peers are great. Stopping in, helping, any kind of way that you can get a better sense of what's happening is really useful. Work with the team. I hate to talk about this, but it's a real reality. Educators are working very hard, long hours, many kids, new mandates, pressures. It's not, I'm sure you're not surprised to know it's not a job filled with thanks, right? It's not a job that's seen in lots of ways as important in real significant ways. And so these sort of amazing educators are doing the best they can with what they have often. And so when I say work with educators, sometimes I mean come together at the team and say, how can we do this together? What can I do to support? If you have the capacity to do those things. But really kind of coming together and using the word team approach, us, we, those kind of things, as opposed to coming in a sort of adversarial role. Know the law very clearly. So spend that time looking at very least, what's the definition of least restrictive environment? What do supplemental aid supports and services look like? What are those things? Because essentially the law says that kids should be in general education settings with their general education peers and provided supplemental aid supports and services so they can be successful. That's what special education is. And so knowing all those supplemental aid supports and services, really important. So you can go to the meeting and before they say your child needs to be removed for this thing, you can say, what if we tried different supports, right? I guess, Charmaine, do you have any questions? I have a couple more points. Do you have any questions about those things so far?
No, and I don't know. I know in some of your classes and when I've heard you speak at conferences, you mention a list that sometimes you'll go through and say, has this been tried? Has this been tried? And I can't remember if that's an article on your website or is there a way for people to get that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking. So, I know for sure it's in the Educator's Handbook. So,
okay.
There's a book that I've written called The Educator's Handbook for Inclusive Services. Charmaine's holding it up right there. That book contains that long list that you're speaking of, Charmaine. It might be at the end of our discussion, I'll send folks to the website and show you where all these articles that are free are. And I think that in one article, maybe called Achieving Inclusion, it's an article for parents about how to do that. It might be in there. I just can't promise.
Okay, so if people want that and you're watching us live or watching on the replay, you could just type in the word list in the comment box and I'll come back and give you a link so we can get you that information.
Oh, great. And I can send you just the handout.
Okay.
So perfect.
Cool. So no, go on. I think these are great. We have more people joining us and thanking you for the information. So you're getting lots of thumbs up and hearts for love.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. The next thing is, when I thought about this question, what can parents do? The next thing I thought of was plan an inclusive IEP. And so what I mean by that is, I mentioned before that what's written on paper doesn't always match what's happening in the classroom. But I should tell you that what's written on paper can be very helpful for you as parents. And so think about the IEP goals that are written. So make sure that so it's okay if your child is not on grade level, right? I'm just going to imagine that you're a parent of a child that's not on grade level for reading. That's fine. It doesn't mean that your child can't be included. It means in the IEP goals, you're going to put kind of age appropriate goals in there, and then the supports necessary. So when you're writing those goals, you're going to use, if they're a third grader, you're going to use third grade content standards. But it's okay to say with support or building those supports. And then actually, Charmaine, I know you've got good information on this about how to create IEP goals that are inclusive. But I think always, age-appropriate curricular goals. Think about them leading to meaningful outcomes for your child. Making sure that they occur in natural settings and times throughout the day. Here's an example. Most of the time in traditional schools that aren't thinking about inclusion, they think at 10:30, I remove this child to go work on their speech and language goals in a separate room, right? And that's really opposite of what's best practice. What's best practice is, what are my child's goals? Let's say that it's making a request to a peer. That's a goal that a child has. Well, that should be happening throughout the day in natural environments, not at 10:30 down the hall with someone who's paid to be with them. And so putting right within the context of the goals and the locations, ways that they can occur in natural settings throughout the day. I once saw a student who was learning the skill of zipping their coat. It was an occupational therapist working with this child. And I said, so all the kids were running out to recess. And I was like, what is happening? And there was an occupational therapist working. He had to do it 10 times with 80% accuracy or some such nonsense. And so I said to the occupational therapist, what if his goal changed to asking a peer to help him with his coat? And the kid overheard me and turned. His name is Michael. He turns to another kid and says, can you help me zip? And the kid zips and they just take off. They decided it was much better, a much better plan. But it's just the way that we think about schooling is so, it's basically taking a whole child and breaking him into small parts and remediating him in those ways. And so instead thinking about, here's my child, what are their needs, and how can they be met right within the context of general education? The other thing is, it's okay. I'll just use an example that's right in front of me. So I was just supporting a student in biology, 12th grade student. Her name is Sophie. And so Sophie has Down syndrome, and she certainly doesn't read at grade level. But a good example is, while participating in 12th grade biology, she's able to name and describe 4 big ideas from each unit of study with 80% accuracy. What that goal does is it causes us to practice that, right? If learning 4 big ideas, now this team has since rewritten this, because guess what? Sophie was able to create a PowerPoint with about 20 big ideas from the last lesson, and they saw this and they thought, wow, at the beginning of the year, our goal was 4 big ideas, right? And so now they're making those goals meet her needs better. The other thing I like to do in goals themselves is put peers in those goals. A good example, while working in a group with 2 to 4 peers, Noah will successfully take turns 4 out of 5 times. Turn taking is a common need, right, for us to put in an IEP. That's great. But put in peers, and now guess where we have to practice it? In natural environments. And so there's a way to sort of force the hand of the team to say, this is where I want these goals to happen, so let's practice them in those environments.
Oh, exactly. And I share with parents too that foundation of, when you're first looking at, hopefully quite a bit of discussion on your child's strengths and interests, and then when you get into the needs, to talk about how he needs, typical age peer models for, communication skills or whatever. And like you said, and then in that goal, follow it up. I know I put in, during the 2nd grade reading group, Sam will, so yeah, I think we need to look at that. Our building our case for inclusion comes at the beginning of the meeting, and not just when we're talking about what the least restrictive environment is at the end. Because then when you get to the end, it's like, what placement? Well, he can't be in a special ed room if his goal is during the 2nd grade reading group, he's going to do this, So yeah, I just love your ideas for using the language right there in the goals.
I like it in the goals, and I want to just underline what you said, underscore, and maybe you and I can brainstorm to help people, because this is a question I get asked a lot. So what Charmaine is talking about is that present level of educational performance that comes at the very beginning, where you do strengths. And you might be saying, what strengths? Like, you might be thinking, oh, I looked at my child's IEP. I don't even know what section you're talking about. The very beginning present level of educational performance is supposed to have strengths, strategies, and needs. So Charmaine, let's strategize and sort of brainstorm. Some ideas for needs that you can put that begin to build your case would be, he needs peer behavioral models. What does that mean? He needs students who behave in grade appropriate ways. Okay. Communication models. It means peers that communicate at age appropriate ways. He needs speech and language models. She needs peer interactions. She needs social supports. She needs all those kinds of things that you can explain up there, so that when you get to the goals, you can put them in, and then when you talk about placement towards the end of the meeting, you've made your case, and now it seems like a really important place to put that student.
Right, right. And one of the things I'm developing this 5-day challenge for parents, and one of the things that I want them to do is to take, like a red pen and highlight the needs that are written in the IEP. Take a green pen and highlight all the strengths and the positive things. And just visually look at your IEP. Do you see more red ink or do you see more green ink? And that can be a cue that my next IEP meeting, we need to be spending some more time talking about strengths, interests, gifts, and how we can. And then the other trick that I find, Julie, is sometimes it gets written in the IEP, but then I want them to take like that Paula Cluth next step, where if we know this is a strength, how can we tap into that when we're teaching them new things? What's the strategy we're going to use? So that's that bridge that I think sometimes is missing, that I try to help teachers understand. It's not just we want to talk about all the great things about our kid. I want you as a teacher then to use that knowledge to figure out some great strategies.
Right. I'm just jotting it down because Paula Cluth does a lot of work on this, and I love it too, like you said. But you can simply, I don't know if you can see in my thing, but I just did a teacher strength strategies, right? Where you take every strength that your child has. I'm just going to use an example. Maybe your child is really talented at art. Okay, this is a student who loves to draw. So you'll write in the strengths box something about talented artist, or really visual spatial, loves to represent things in pictures, whatever strength, however you want to write that. But then the strategy that accompanies that is, when learning new concepts or ideas, student can jot pictures to help them remember, right? And so you take that big idea and move it into a strategy that can easily be put into the IEP, especially in the present level of educational performance. But you can quickly see how that could also go into a goal. So during a science or social studies lecture, student is allowed to use visual note taking, so meaning pictures, so that they can remember those ideas. So that's how strengths turn into strategies, turn into goals. And don't forget to say something like, in a general education setting, or at the beginning, because that's an important piece. Yeah.
Right, right. Well, these are great tips, and we've had some more parents join us. So I want to welcome in Cindy and Erica and Kara and Tatina. So Erica has a question. She says, how would you do that? And I'm not if the automatic block you from, so I'm trying to figure this out. In my case, they don't care what I think because I don't have a degree in their eyes. So
yeah. Can you remind me the parent's name who just said that?
So Erica.
Erica, thanks for the question. And I hear you, I feel you, I've seen it. I've sat next to families who feel very not empowered, right, in those meetings. And so what you're getting at is a really fundamental, common question for families, which is, I can say anything at my meeting. I can say anything I want, but I won't be valued. My voice won't be heard. No one will put that into the IEP. And so I don't have a quick, these are 5 things to do. I wish I did. But instead, what I'll tell you is try again. Come back to the team in new ways. I sometimes think it's appropriate and okay to say, have a little bit of a professional conversation, and you say at the beginning of the team meeting, so I don't feel very valued when I bring up ideas, and I'm wondering how to make sure that my ideas are represented here. Those conversations are hard to have, and I don't know if that's where I'd start, but it sounds like you're down a path far enough that you might be able to say some of those things. You can also remind them that you're a co-equal member, therefore you are part of that team legally. You can obviously bring an advocate. Sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't. You can obviously bring a lawyer. Sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't. And what I mean is sometimes it does more harm than good, and it just really depends on your situation. But I think clarity, essentially at the end of the day, it's your child, right? This is the whole goal, is to make sure that your child has the best educational day possible. And so figuring out, and I often talk about picking my battles because I have to do this in my own life a lot. There are lots of ways we might feel devalued, but I sometimes get really clear on, okay, I feel devalued in these meetings, but my goal in this meeting, the first goal is that when they're telling me they're going to remove my child for reading class, my goal is that not happen. And so I kind of stay really present with that goal in mind. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to hear you in your new empowered voice and be able to, take that. But obviously, you probably know what happens if they won't, right? There's mediation, there's due process, etc. But there's a lot of just human interaction. It's very much about creating a team atmosphere and sometimes being pretty upfront about what you need in this team. Charmaine, you have something to add to that?
Well, I was going to say, I always say the 3 R's of advocacy are relationships, relationships, relationships. And, usually when parents get to the point where they feel like they need to call an advocate, and I hear from them, it's because communication and trust has broken down. So, that is such a critical part to, to build up again in order to create that teamwork.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to add one thing about if your goal is inclusion, and that's what they're not listening to, which is these are most of the parents that I'm talking to.
Right.
My goal is inclusion. They won't listen. They won't have it. They won't hear anything about it. There are lots of strategies. Later, I'm going to tell you a link that'll take you to an article that I wrote with Christy Casa, and it's all about sort of how to create inclusive schools or inclusive experiences for your kids. But there's a section about what if they still say no, right? You've tried everything. You've tried relationships. You've tried it. At that point, there are a couple things you can do. You can say, when people say at the IEP meeting, when they say something like, yeah, we really can't. And then whatever the reason is, we can't because whatever the reason, I often turn it around when I'm at meetings and say, oh, I wonder if training would help that. If you can't, we can put training right in the IEP. Gosh, I know someone who could provide this training, right? Not that I can train all over the country, but I know a lot of people who can. Or what if we brought in another opinion? What if we brought in independent educational evaluation? That's the work that I do a lot of, but I have many colleagues all over the country that do that work, where we go in and actually observe for the day and then provide a report. I'm doing one next week, right, where I go in, I observe for the day, and I provide a report to the team that says, do these things to help your child be included. You can send them to conferences. Syracuse University has the coolest Summer Leadership Institute conference. So many parents are sending their administrators to these conferences. I don't mean they're paying for it, but they're sometimes providing a lot of information about the conference and saying, go. This is a 3-day conference where all we do is we train administrators, special ed directors, and directors of special ed and principals, all kinds of administrators. How do we do this work? So people come from all over the country for 3 days, and we teach them how to create inclusive schools. And it's awesome. So there are all kinds of things that you can actually suggest as opposed to just sort of getting mad at these team meetings. You can write a letter. You could just simply write a letter that says, this is how I'm feeling. These are the ways I feel like we're being ignored. And these are my asks. This is what I'm asking for. Sometimes when it's in writing and not verbally, people take it in a different way. I help families write letters all the time. I know on my Facebook page, I have a letter template that I think is really useful. I'd have to find it. But, and then obviously, mediation, due process, Don't forget your parent centers. Don't forget legal representation if you need it. I don't know. It's a long answer, but I hear you, and I really empathize with you because I know that feeling, which is it doesn't matter what I say. I sit there and I hear it, and that's the end of it.
I know. Um, and what I'd like to do, because we have a little bit of time left, I'm going to check and see if we have any other specific questions. Let's see, Rebecca, she said, could the link for the Syracuse University conference be shared? And what Julie can do, or I can do, is after our broadcast today, just on my Visions and Voices Together Facebook page, we can give you the link in the comment box. So yeah, thanks for asking for that, Rebecca, because that would be a tremendous value for your district and your school team if they could participate in their conference. So that's wonderful. I do, before we close today, I do want to share Julie's Facebook site. So let me pull up that slide. This is her inclusive schooling. And she does have, go ahead.
Let me just say that's my website. So it's inclusiveschooling.com. And I'm going to tell you about, if you go to inclusiveschooling.com, and I'm going to tell you about some tabs on the top that might be useful for you. So there's a whole section called courses. And one of the courses that I offer is it's called Inspired Advocate, and it's a course for parents, and it's 10 classes long. That's right under courses. There's also a new one called Inspired Paraprofessional, and many parents are actually gifting this to their paraprofessionals or sending their administrators to learn about this, because what I do is I teach paraprofessionals how to support kids in inclusive ways. So I think that's a really useful thing for you to know. There's a Work With Us tab, and that you can send us an email and request us to come work at your kid's school or to do an independent educational evaluation. Then there's a Books tab, and all the books are right there that I've written. And I know, Charmaine, you were about to talk about them, so I'll skip that for a second. But one last thing is there's an article. Okay, so here are the books Charmaine just put up. So if I were a parent and I wondered what I should read myself, I would read the Educator's Handbook for Inclusive School Practices. It's the green one in the bottom. Many parents have given the Principal's Handbook to their principals, and that's how to design inclusive schools. The paraprofessional one is a really nice one for paraprofessionals to read and understand how to do this work. If your kid is in a co-taught classroom, Paula Kluth and I just wrote a book called 30 Days to the Co-Taught Classroom. It's a really great read about how to do co-teaching. And then speech and language and occupational therapists are often people who need more ideas about how to do this work inclusively. So those are just other ideas. They're all in the books and you can get them right there. And then lastly, there's an articles section, and the articles are just things that you can quickly download and just read or hand out. It doesn't matter. There's a parent advocacy section, and my favorite article there is called Achieving Inclusion, and it's written by Christy Casa and I. We just wrote another article called The Other Side of the Table, and it's really about parents' experiences in IEP meetings, and I think it's really useful. There's also a whole section on articles about behavior, articles that I call research, which is just the research around inclusive education, and then a few articles on autism that might be useful for families.
Great. And Tim has a question. He said, who should we approach first about inclusion, the teacher, an administrator, or the special education department?
That's a good question, Tim. I would say kind of all of the above. I don't know if there's an order that works better. But essentially, as soon as you decide, boy, I really want my child included more, or I want to make sure they remain included, right? Your IEP team is really the point of influence that parents have built in. But besides that, it doesn't mean you can't write a letter. It doesn't mean you can't have a meeting and just say, boy, I think we're really missing the mark here. I think my child needs to be included more than they are. So how do I go about that? Every district will have a little bit of a different process, and it's very personality based. So some districts, the director of special ed is very involved, and others they're not. So just saying, this is my dream or goal for my child, and I don't think we're there right now, and I want to talk about how can we get there. Achieving Inclusion, that little article that's free, that's a good place to start. It's kind of a step-by-step. And I forgot to tell you, there's a free app that I wrote called I Advocate. It's just free. It's on the App Store, iAdvocate, spelled IADVOCATE. Anyway, that is common reasons that school districts give for not including children, and then what your response to that can be, plus the legal response to that, and then a bunch of resources. So I think that's a really useful thing for parents. My goal in creating that app was to have something that you could use at the meeting. I don't know that it really functions in that way because you can't really do that at the time, but to prepare for your IEP meeting, it's invaluable, in my opinion. I think it's really, really useful.
Yeah, and I apologize. I meant to put that up on this, that have a slide for that also, because I do have that on my phone. And what Julie's referring to is like those frequently asked questions or statements that you get as roadblocks. And then she gives you, exact or suggested wording that you can use when you hear those kinds of comments. So I put I advocate in the comment box. So I would encourage people to download that app that Julie made. So we're coming up to the closing time here. I do have an IEP meeting I have to run off to, so it's like, darn, I wish we had more time with Julie. But I want to thank you so much for carving out this time for us, Julie. And a quote that I like that I wanted to share with folks today is just to encourage you to stop being stuck in the belief that your child is not ready for inclusion. It's time. Believe in his or her competence. Yeah. So, Julie, do you have any last closing words that you'd like to share with us?
I didn't plan on this, but when you asked that question, I think about Harriet Tubman, and if you're tired, keep going. This is an exhausting work. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And we hope, if you go to our website, we've got lots of ways to support you in your efforts and work. And it is worth it. So thank you for having me, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie. So just to remind our viewers that we'll be on next Thursday again, and I'll be posting information about our next week's guest. But until then, everybody, as I say often in my newsletters, we got to keep on keeping on. And this is some contact information if you need to get a hold of me. But I appreciate people being here live and watching the replay. And everybody take care and have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye.